Good afternoon. Welcome to the Medical Center Hour program. I'm Julie Connolly with the Center for Bioethics and Humanities, and I'm delighted that you're here on such a beautiful day. The program today is entitled Medicine in Translation, Bridging the Cultural Gap Between Doctor and Patient. I'll show you this book again, and if you haven't seen, the UVA bookstore has copies for sale. Our speaker's book with the same title. Today's lecture is also the Koppaka V. Rao Lectureship in the Humanities and Medicine. The lectureship was endowed in 2005 by the Koppaka Family Foundation. Some of you have heard me introduce Dr. Rao in the past. He was a professor in the College of Pharmacy at the University of Florida from 1969 to 1998. Where he did research on the identification of new drugs, mostly from natural sources. He was the author of over 140 peer-reviewed publications and had 33 patents. He had a passion for teaching and was awarded the Teacher of the Year award 3 different times during his tenure there. Prior to his academic career, he served for 15 years as the manager of chemical research at the Pfizer Cancer Research Institute. There he discovered 30 agents that have been used in human clinical trials, including mithromycin. He grew up in a tiny village in South India. He, in India, earned a doctorate in science and organic chemistry and was awarded a scholarship by the government of India to study in the United States. He was the first member of his family that had had the opportunity to seek higher education and first to travel to the United States for further education. He received a PhD in biochemistry from the University of Wisconsin. After his death in the late 90s, his wife, Mrs. Sita K. Rao, and her family created the Koppaka Family Foundation. This had been a dream of his and something that they had talked about for years in advance. The purpose of the foundation was sort of twofold, but the one part that we're really interested in here is advancing the cause of medical education, particularly communication between doctor and patient. At his death, in the weeks leading up to his death, there had been many problems in communication between healthcare providers and the family, so they really decided what they wanted to do was try to remedy this problem to the extent that it was possible, funding this endowment and many other lectureships through the country. They also have endowed part of the foundation to work in the arts and have endowed lectureships in other universities in Indian cultural studies. His daughter, Jaya Rao, which a few of you might remember, was an internal medicine resident here at the University of Virginia in the 1990s. She's currently on the faculty of UNC in the School of Pharmacy. Her brother, Ram Koppaka, is also a physician and works for CDC in the international work around influenza prevention. Both of them send their regrets in not being able to be with us this year. They're generally here, but because we scheduled the program fairly early this year and because of their heavy schedules at work, they weren't able to be here. But we certainly thank the family for their generosity in this endeavor with us. It's certainly been our privilege to work with them. And we're happy today that we've been able to ask Danielle Ofri to visit with us. She's been here a couple times before, and we've enjoyed her teachings. It's interesting, as I reviewed her CV, to see that she is has a doctorate in pharmacology, kind of following along Dr. Rao's. She is an internist and did her internship and residency at NYU at the Bellevue Hospital. I completed those in 1993. She presently is an associate professor at New York University and continues to be an attending physician at Bellevue. She co-founded in 2000 the Bellevue Literary Review, which a few copies here, and there's subscription forms on the table. She has won many awards, not only for her illustrious career as a physician, but also for her writing career. She's published 3 collections of essays. Again, the one that we're looking at particularly today is Medicine in Translation, and we have copies available there upstairs. There's also 2 other books, Incidental Findings and another. So we're really, really pleased to have Danielle with us. You may hear her from time to time on NPR or see some of her stories that are published in the New York Times or the Washington Post. So she's a spokesperson for all of us in the medical world. So Danielle, we're thrilled that you're here and look forward to your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Julie, and thank you, Marcia, for inviting me. And it's an honor to speak with someone's legacy, as you've described. My interest is in doctor-patient communication and the many challenges and the many successes that we have. Before I begin, one of the things you do when you do grand rounds of any amount is you sign a little disclosure or financial conflicts of interest before any lecture, but I have no compunction about shamelessly stumping for the Bellevue Literary Review. Literary magazines don't make any money, so there's no financial conflict of interest. So I brought a few copies, and there's even a buy one, get one free subscription form outside, and please do take advantage. I also want to put in one small plug for the Bellevue Literary Press, which we spun off the Literary Review a few years ago, and its book Tinkers that won the Pulitzer Prize in Fiction this year. And it's quite a big deal. The last time a small press won a Pulitzer Prize was almost 30 years ago, before many of you were probably born. So it's quite exciting. It's a beautiful, wonderful book. It's so nice that you have Medical Center Hour at 12:30. Our grand rounds in the Department of Medicine at NYU is at 8 o'clock in the morning. And those of you who've been to grand rounds kind of know the routine. Everyone gets here. The lights immediately go down to planetarium black, and the first of 50 slides of Western blots come on the screen. And by around 8:15, 8:20, the PGY1 class is in their REM sleep, and by 8:30, the PGY3s, and of course the senior faculty were out at 8:05. And, but then the speaker says, I once had a patient who, and everyone wakes up, because now there's going to be a story with character, plot, drama, disagreement, tension, and that's what I think we're programmed to find exciting. I mean, I love Western blots. I spent my PhD doing all sorts of Western blots, and you could put 1,000, I don't really like them, but it's not the same as hearing a story. So I want to use stories today to talk a little bit about some of the journeys I've taken with my patients, particularly in the realm of culture and the different cultures. Bellevue is a city hospital. It's the oldest public hospital in the country, functioning since 1736, and we see the waves of immigrants coming into America, and it's kind of a testament to the different generations that have passed through. So the story that I want to start with is about a patient of mine. She's still my patient, and I wrote about her for the New England Journal of Medicine a couple of years back. But since I'm in denial for my need for reading glasses, I'm going to read from the book because the font's a little bit larger. And the piece is called Torment. I groan when I catch sight of her name on the patient roster, Nazma Uddin, not again. I dread her visits, and today is no exception. A small, plump woman, Mrs. Uddin is cloaked in robe, headscarf, and veil, all opaque blue polyester. Only her eyes peer out from the sea of dark blue. She's trailed, as usual, by her 11-year-old daughter, Azina, who wears a flowered headscarf but no veil. Mrs. Uddin flops into the chair next to my desk, and Azina perches on the exam table, her white Nikes peeking out from beneath the full-length gown. Mrs. Uddin unsnaps her veil, something she only does with her female doctor, revealing her weathered cheeks, and the litany begins. Oh, doctor, she says, pinching the sides of her head with skin-paling force. The pain is no good. After this brief foray into English, she slips into Bengali, aiming her barrage of complaints at Azina, who translates them to me in fits and spurts while fiddling with her wire-rimmed glasses. There is abdominal pain and headache, diarrhea and insomnia, back pain and aching arches, a rash and gas pains, itchy ears, and a cough, no appetite, and more headache. The feeling begins, a dull cringing in my stomach that gradually creeps outward until my entire body is sapped in foreboding. I know that I should be focused on Mrs. Uddin's words, but I fear for my sanity and my ability to get through this visit and the next 10 patients. I scan the computer while she moans about her shins and her coccyx, and I can see that she's been to neurology clinic, rehab clinic, pain management, GYN, podiatry, GI, all in the 5 weeks since I last saw her. Doctor, she's pleading with me now, again in English, and I hurriedly refocus on her. Why so much pain? The leathery grain of Mrs. Uddin's skin and her seemingly permanent submission in the world of the sick make me think of her as elderly. I'm always shocked when the computer reminds me that she is 35. Why, Dr. Why? Her laments are punctuated by the resonant thud of Azina's sneakers, banging repetitively and absentmindedly against the metal exam table. The truth is, I can't do anything for Mrs. Udine. I've talked to her endlessly about stress and depression, which I'm sure underlie many of her complaints. But she never follows through with the psychiatry referrals or the antidepressant prescriptions. Her resistance to my efforts sometimes makes me feel as though she's in a personal battle against me. I start to resent her, to hate everything about her. I hate to see her name on the roster. I hate to see her in the waiting room. I hate the whine in her voice that is detectable even when she is speaking Bengali. I hate the veil that she wears. How can she let herself be hidden away in a sea of hard polyester? How can she buy into a culture that seems to find every aspect of her so repulsive or so threatening that it must submerge her in the darkest, most stultifying of material? There's not one iota of design or pattern. No, her body doesn't even merit the slightest print, flower, or delicate fold, only harsh, opaque, heavy, airless, unforgiving material. And I hate that she routinely keeps her daughter out of school to facilitate her wild overuse of the medical system. Whenever I treat one complaint, another bursts to the surface. An antacid temporarily relieves her stomach pains, but then she will have palpitations. A migraine medication partially assuages her headache, but then she will have intractable hiccups and swollen knees. I can't breathe, she says. I don't eat. I don't sleep. Well, if that's truly the case, I want to retort, how is it that you are still alive? I shudder as I realize that I am slipping too far. The annoyance and resentment are getting the better of me. But sometimes I wish that she would just disappear, out of my office, out of my hospital, out of the city, off this planet. How is it that she emigrated thousands of miles from her obscure village in Bangladesh to end up precisely in the catchment area of my clinic, and then randomly in my office when there are 150 other medical attendings and house staff she could have been assigned to? Back at our first visit, if I could even remember that far, I am sure I asked open-ended questions and responded with concern to each of her concerns. Now I ask as few questions as possible. For fear of eliciting new unsolvable complaints, I avoid eye contact, and I never do a review of systems. I focus on the computer, tuning out her words. I have tried to placate her by ordering every test she wants. I have tried to set limits by refusing to order every test that she wants. And nothing helps, and now I am angry. You are healthy, I say to Mrs. Udine sternly. No reaction. I turn to the daughter. Tell your mother that she is healthy, that all her tests are normal. Azina's face is blank as she translates. After speaking, the daughter looks down at her sneakers, her light headscarf tumbling over her shoulders as she lowers her gaze. Are you almost finished? She asks. It takes me a moment to realize that Azina is talking to me. I have to take her home on the bus, she says, and then I have to take another bus to school. I don't want to miss the whole day. Can't your mother come to clinic by herself, I ask? We do have interpreters available. My mother's afraid to go out by herself, she says in a voice that wants to be belligerent but is too weary. My brother is in college and my father works, so I have to take her to the doctor. She stares back down at her sneakers, which have stopped banging and are now wriggling from side to side like lively caterpillars. I turn from the computer and really look at Azina for what feels like the first time. Her eyes are smooth sandalwood, magnified into iridescent discs by the thick lenses of her glasses. What is it like at home, I ask. She doesn't do anything, Azina mumbles. She just sits there. Azina's face has a prepubescent chubbiness that is somehow incongruous with the seriousness of her headscarf and glasses. Tears begin to slide down her cheeks, and her voice rises in a warble. She doesn't cook dinner anymore. She doesn't go anywhere. My mind begins to paint a picture of the Udine home, and I see a little girl cut off from her mother, reeling in the wretched vacuum that depression creates. A child conscripted to be the fulcrum of cultures, illnesses, and torments, all while trying to complete the 5th grade. I am mortified now that I was so consumed with my own feelings of being overwhelmed when before me sits a child who is drowning, a child grasping the rickety timbers that can barely support her mother and that threaten to sink them both. It is the innocence of this pain, its simplicity, that both shocks me back to reality and humbles me. I realize that never in all my visits with Mrs. Udine have I paid any attention to Azina. She was always a mere appendage to her mother's appointments, trailing along, obediently translating and directing as so many first-generation children do. Though I'd like to write off Mrs. Udine as just another complainer, as one who can't hiccup without demanding an MRI, she is truly suffering. Her daughter is truly suffering. I am not suffering. I am actually the complainer. I am the one who can't face this patient without immediately rolling my eyes and turning off my compassion. The reality is that I am profoundly discomfited by my inability to treat Mrs. Udine. I take the hands of both Azina and her mother, for they are both my patients now. Depression is a painful illness, I say. Broken bones, broken souls can hurt as much as broken bones. I explain about antidepressants and the importance of psychotherapy, and we negotiate a contract for treatment. This time, I include a stipulation that Mrs. Udine come alone or with her husband, that Azina stay in school. Azina wipes her tears. Mrs. Udine gathers her papers and snaps the veil back over her face. She promises to take the medications and see the psychiatrist. Of course, we've been down this road before, many times, and I won't be surprised if she's back next month with a new physical ailment, not taking her antidepressants, having missed the appointment with the psychiatrist, and I won't be surprised if I once again dread the visit. But I think, or at least I hope, that I'll no longer view Nazma Udine as a personal torment. Azina has cured me of that. When this essay was published in the New England Journal of Medicine in 2004, I received a lot of mail, and most of it was encouraging. In fact, my Bellevue colleagues said, "Oh, that's my patient, I have that woman." But there was one letter that stood out from 2 Saudi Arabian physicians, one in Riyadh and one working in London. And while they appreciated the epiphany at the end of the essay, they were upset about the inflammatory nature, and that's their word, of the description of the veil. I was prepared to put aside their letters in knee-jerk reaction, but the author said, "We feel compelled to enlighten you as to why torment hurts us." And the idea of the power of words, and the power of words to hurt, gave me pause. It certainly had not been my intention to hurt anyone by publishing this. The authors went on to say that post 9/11, sadly, we now inhabit a lonely, insular, and much altered world. And these words reminded me of Nazma Udine and her lonely, insular, and much altered world. After a long litany of the very real discriminations faced by Muslims in today's society, the authors went on to say, Dr. Ofri's insensitivity, in even revealing her private angst, does untold damage. The letter ended with, "Sir, we are offended and disappointed by the journal." Now I'll skip the irony of a letter decrying stereotypes based on religion that freely exploits those about gender. In fact, the editor of the New England Journal of that section is a woman. But the question they bring up is quite salient. How honest should we be when it comes to revealing our inner thoughts, particularly the ones that are not so appetizing? My goal in publishing Torment was not to show the world how racist I am, and believe me, I could think of easier ways to humiliate myself on the public stage, but precisely to face up to the parts of me that I'm not proud of, the parts that conflict with my general self-image, the parts that lurk in the muck of our id, the parts that worm their way through our subconscious and insidiously inform our decisions and thoughts, the parts that are the target, or should be the target, when we focus on erasing cultural misunderstandings, if we want to get real results. I don't think the authors of the letter understood that. I think they saw the manifest content, were understandably hurt and insulted, but didn't key into the process. I don't hate Nazma Udine, and I don't hate Islam and Arabs. I'm the classic left-wing liberal who thinks there really is going to be peace in the Middle East. Half of my family is Middle Eastern. My father's family came from Yemen, and they trudged on foot and on camel across Saudi Arabia to Palestine at the end of the Ottoman Empire. My grandfather, age 6, and his sister, age 5, on two sides of a camel saddlebag. And my grandparents' home in Israel was a mix of Arabic, Yemenite accented Hebrew, and the spiciest of Yemenite Arabic foods. My father, when he came to this country, was far more fluent in Arabic than he was in English. My grandparents and all paternal relatives are quite dark-skinned and grew up being called Kushin, which is the Hebrew equivalent of nigger. But of course, the authors of the letter wouldn't know any of that. They made their own assumptions about what an American, presumably white physician would think. I don't hate Mrs. Udin's religion or her veil. What I do hate is how badly she makes me feel, and how she constantly reminds me of how I'm unable to cure her pains. And in the heat of that moment, I was unable to put my finger on the true source of my frustration, and so the emotions bubbled over, making full use of my id, and targeted her and what she represented. I'm not proud at all of the path that my rationalities took, but I don't think I have any chance of changing them if I don't own up. So this made me wonder, just how racist are we doctors? I mean, the people I work with at Bellevue are thoughtful, open-minded, compassionate people. There aren't any closet skinheads or KKK members, at least that I'm aware of. Who knows about the next, generation or house staff. But study after study reveals consistent conscious and unconscious biases on the part of Western white doctors. In the conscious realm, white physicians rate minorities as less intelligent, more prone to substance abuse, people they wouldn't want to be neighbors with. But in the unconscious, and perhaps the more concerning realm, white Western doctors tend to do fewer cardiac caths in minority patients, treat pain less aggressively, do less chemotherapy, and the list goes depressingly on. And this seems to hold true no matter what society we examine. In Germany, German physicians feel they do a much worse job with their patients of Turkish origin than those of German-born origin. When I lived in Costa Rica, I learned that Costa Ricans look at Nicaraguans as sneaking over the border and taking advantage of their services and healthcare system. And it even works both ways. I met Costa Ricans who would never want to be treated by a doctor of Nicaraguan descent. Even in Sweden, that standard bearer of liberalism and probity, Swedish doctors feel they do a much worse job with foreign-born patients than with native-born. So is this simply innate, or so culturally inbred as to be practically innate? All of this multicultural education that we receive, and no offense to anyone here who teaches this, but it often feels so limited. A couple of years ago, our administration sent out an email to the entire staff of Bellevue Hospital about Hispanic culture. And they wanted to make the doctors and nurses and staff aware and sensitive to some nuances of Hispanic culture, since our patient population is heavily Hispanic. And I went back and found the email, because it's all there, and it was an earnest document that stated things like, and these are direct quotes, Hispanics value family and camaraderie. Religion is very important. Hospital food is typically too bland for Hispanic tastes. They didn't specify which cultural group likes the hospital food. Hispanics prefer vibrant colors. Hispanics often speak rapidly and use their hands. I was frankly embarrassed. I mean, who are they addressing? A white supremacist militia in North Dakota? I mean, this is New York City, for goodness sakes. Anyone with half a neuron who walks down one block knows these things. And I know they meant well. And I know they meant to avoid stereotypes, but these generalizations felt awkward, almost pitiable. There was a recent article about cultural challenges that caught my eye. The researchers interviewed a bunch of doctors, and these doctors said they did their best to remain neutral about their patients' culture. And they were proud of this fact. This was their conscious effort to avoid stereotype and bias. And they felt that this unfazable neutrality offered the most comfortable, least threatening environment for their patients. But when the researchers interviewed the patients, they found that patients often perceive this neutrality as disinterest, even coldness. Many wanted their doctors to ask about their culture, to journey with them, as it were, into their lives. And with Nazma Udin, I did my best to remain neutral. I recognized that my negative feelings about her veil were inappropriate, at best stereotyped, at worst racist. They had no business being present in a doctor-patient interaction. And so I consciously pushed them under the table whenever I saw her. And this went on awkwardly for several years. And then I found myself on a journey with my patient, precipitated by an unexpected event. Nazma Udin was back on my list for the morning clinic session, weeks earlier than her scheduled appointment, but I was not surprised. When I called her in from the waiting room, she came down the hall accompanied by a slender young woman cloaked entirely in black. A black headscarf covered her veil, resting just above her eyebrows, and a thick black veil came up over the bridge of her nose, leaving the barest slit for her coal-lined eyes. An even smaller space than Mrs. Udin's loose veil, which at least allowed her forehead to be exposed. The young woman's hands were encased in black linen gloves, and she moved like an apparition with barely a rustle of her black robes. There was something both exotic and forbidding about her. I ushered the women in. As usual, Mrs. Udin immediately unsnapped her veil, but the woman shrouded in black did not. I wondered if she was a relative visiting from Bangladesh. "Good morning," I said. Mrs. Udin's face was scrunched with frustration. She took out the bottle of antidepressants I prescribed for her at the last visit and plopped it on my desk. I think we're up to Zoloft by then. "These pills no good," she said. "They make veins in my neck swell, fire burning in my head, no good." "For how long did you take the pills?" I asked. Mrs. Udin waved away my question like she was swatting a fly. "I take few days, but no good. I need better pills." If nothing else, Mrs. Udin offered consistency. Every visit was predictable. We tussled gently over the same issues, negotiated compromises that we had tried before, and gave the whole thing another go. We'd been doing this for 8 years now. I imagined us aging together, each offering the other a strand of stability. "How are things at home?" I asked. "Home good," Mrs. Udin answered, the tautness in her face easing. She leaned toward the woman in black. "Azina visiting, so things good for this week." Azina? This was Azina? Chubby, bespectacled Azina was now a slim high school junior. At the mention of her name, Azina turned toward us. "Mom," she said, and I could see her eyes roll within the tiny slit of her veil. "Stop making such a big deal, it's just a visit, come on." Azina was attending a Muslim boarding school in upstate New York and was home for vacation. She slouched in the chair, and the cuffs of her jeans peeked out from under the edge of her black gown. "How was school?" I asked Azina, wondering about her transformation. "Boring," she replied. "No boys in the classes, and they don't allow color." I was intrigued by the differences between Azina's veil and her mother's veil. Mrs. Udin's veil hung loosely over her face like a curtain and unsnapped with ease. Azina's was a black cloth pulled so tight that I could make out the contours of her nose, cheeks, and lips. It was tied somewhere in the back, under layers of headscarf and gown. It looked vastly more uncomfortable to me, like it was smothering. She didn't remove her veil with me, and I wondered if that was because she had become more religious than her mother, perhaps as a result of her boarding school experience. As I contemplated this, it dawned on me how little I actually knew about the Muslim veil. Perhaps it was time for me to learn. I wasn't sure how sensitive a subject the veil was and wondered if it might be considered an affront to broach the issue. But I felt that I knew Mrs. Udin, and by extension Azina, well enough by now, and so I asked somewhat timidly if I might pose a question about the veil. They both nodded. I asked Azina if not removing her veil in my office like her mother did was a sign of increased religiosity. Azina laughed uproariously as soon as the question left my mouth. "No," she said. "The only reason I don't take it off here is that it takes forever to retie, and I'm too lazy. Just ask my mom." Her ease with this, along with the magnitude of difference between my assumptions and her reality, relaxed the conversational birth. I felt comfortable now and asked all sorts of questions about the veil, even naive ones. Azina took the lead in answering, her infectious energy spilling out despite the tight veil that completely wrapped her face. I wanted to know, was it hot under there? Was it hard to breathe? How did you decide what color, what style? Was it a family norm? Was it a mosque norm? Was it a country norm? Azina and her mother chatted amiably, seeming delighted to educate me in the nuances of this aspect of Muslim culture. While the subject had been a little touchy for me, it certainly wasn't for them. Taking a bit of a risk and pressing further, I asked if there was any pressure or coercion in wearing the veil. Mrs. Udine answered this one emphatically. No, she said, the veil is my choice. My husband, he tell me not to wear it. He say people treat me bad. They say I am terrorist. Her voice grew more animated and assured. But veil is between me and Allah. I wear the veil no matter what anyone say. It is my connection to Allah. The conversation proceeded toward Islam in general, and I learned how devout Mrs. Udine was and what pleasure religious observance gave her. The most interesting thing for me, besides all I was learning about the veil, was the transformation that occurred in Mrs. Udine. While discussing Islam and the veil, she became buoyant. All her whininess disappeared. The aches and pains seemed to evaporate. Her voice and body language reclaimed the heft and vitality one would expect from an otherwise healthy 43-year-old woman. This was not a meek, oppressed woman, I thought. This was not a woman beaten down by a patriarchal religion. This was a woman inspired, fortified, dare I say, empowered by her religion. As I finished up my visit with Mrs. Udine, I realized that we just gained a new clinical insight and perhaps a new therapeutic tool. I realized that I might finally look forward to Mrs. Udine's clinic visits. Although I didn't want her to keep Azina out of school for her appointments, I hoped that Azina would come to some of the visits so we could continue my education along with her mother's treatment. So this was my first journey that I took with a patient into the realm of their culture, and one that I have to admit I was a bit hesitant. The veil intimidated me, angered me to some degree, and I was very unsure about treading on this territory. Yet once I took a chance and embarked on this journey, I found myself in an entirely new place with respect to my patient. I still have serious issues about the veil, but they're theoretical and intellectual, no longer personal. And this was when I was able to put my finger on why all these sensitivity training seminars feel so awkward. They usually consist of relatively simplistic facts about different cultures and don't touch the deeper, more personal issue from which I think bias and stereotype often arise. What I learned from this experience is that we can trust ourselves to take journeys with our patients, that we needn't be paragons of neutrality to prove how unbiased we are. We can take chances by inquiring about parts of cultures that are unusual, even off-putting. More often, it's just a matter of being open to the many journeys that present themselves to us and that we are usually too busy or too lazy or too uncomfortable to take advantage of. A few years ago, our hospital invested in a grand system of remote simultaneous interpretation. So rather than rely on the 6-year-old daughter to interpret or the barely bilingual uncle calling in by cell phone from the taxi, we now had this cadre of interpreters secreted somewhere. Who knew? Maybe they weren't even in the hospital. And we had these 2 handheld phones, and all I had to do was dial 1800, and an interpreter would materialize out of thin air. And using the 2 handsets on the phone, the patient and I could speak freely with this voice interpreting simultaneously, kind of like at the UN, which is just about 10 blocks up the road from Bellevue. And I came to view the language phone as just another tool in my office. I used it every day, all the time. Another tool lined up with my stethoscope, my otoscope, my scale, my Xanax, my computer, everything that I needed to get through a day at Bellevue. These bilingual voices simply magically appeared whenever I dialed 1800. One day in clinic, I had one of our many West African patients, and there are very few people around who speak Igbo or Yoruba or Hausa, so we always use the French interpreters, and French is usually the patient's second language. After I finished the interview, I hung up the phone, brought the patient to the checkout, and went back in my room and was filling in all the little physical exam fields in the computerized electronic medical record. And while I was typing, the phone rang. I answered somewhat absent-mindedly while I typed. "Hello, doctor." The voice was familiar, but I couldn't place it. I kept typing, hope they would identify themselves, not put me in that really awkward position of trying to figure out who this person is who knows you. "Is this Dr. Ofri?" the familiar voice asked. "Yes," I said, typing in the peripheral pulses and the abdominal exam. I still couldn't place the voice. "This is the French interpreter who just assisted you with your previous patient." The interpreter? I never even thought about these disembodied voices that spun out of thin air when I dialed 1800 and evaporated when I hung up. But here it was, a real person. I realized, though honestly it only dawned on me after the fact, that I was about to embark on another interesting journey. And if I paid attention, I might learn something. Then of course I panicked. Had I violated some new hospital policy? Had I committed some linguistic sin? Called them a translator instead of an interpreter? Offended Francophile sensitivities, dangled a participle? Who knew? I wanted to ask you a question, he said, if you don't mind. Of course not, I said, preparing for an administrative onslaught. He hesitated, then cleared his voice. Doctor, what is the difference between illness and disease? At that, I really had to sit back and pause. Not only was I being contacted by a member of the medical world with whom I had never actually spoken directly, but I was being asked a really thoughtful question. One, frankly, I didn't recall any student or house staff or attending ever raising. And then I wondered, was this linguistic hair splitting? Or was there a true difference in meaning between the words? And perhaps it was unique to English. In Spanish, I could think of only one word, enfermedad. And the interpreter told me that in French, there's also only one word, maladie, which is why he was having so much trouble interpreting from English, because doctors use both illness and disease freely. And we ended up having this very interesting conversation. After we hung up, a peculiar feeling remained with me. In the nebulous void of the vast hospital machinery, I found a brief kinship with someone who was interested in actually thinking about what we do. But with a click of the phone, he had evaporated, and we're each back in our own little worlds, and I didn't know his name. From then on, whenever I had a French-speaking patient, I hoped my mystery friend would recognize my name or voice, but I never happened upon him. And then many months later, on a Thursday afternoon, I had a patient from Guinea, and of course no one spoke Maninka, so I dialed 1800 and pressed pound 2 for French. And the voice said, "Hey doc, long time no speak." This time I didn't let him go. I kept the phone off after the patient encounter. I wanted to continue our journey. And so I was introduced to Evans, a 34-year-old man from Haiti, a real person. I wanted to know, how is it possible to do simultaneous interpretation, to listen to one language and speak another at the same time? You can't think, he said, you just do it. You hear one thing in French and you force your mouth to speak English. I was in awe of what Evans was describing. With sustained and focused effort, I can occasionally rub my belly and pat my head at the same time. And this greatly impresses my 3 little kids, but that is the limit of my simultaneous abilities. And then he had some questions for me. What's up with the term water pill, he asked me. Why don't doctors just say diuretic? Well, that was an obvious one. Hydrochlorothiazide, that's our formulary diuretic, is obviously too much of a tongue twister. And diuretic seems too technical, so we always use the term pastilla de agua, the pill that makes you produce water. To most patients, Evans said, a water pill is a placebo. Was that what my patients were thinking? No wonder nobody was compliant with their blood pressure medications. So I told Evans that in English we use the term sugar pill to describe a placebo. He said, oh no, to most patients, a sugar pill sounds like there's something in it, actual food, but a water pill sounds like nothing. Somehow, in all my years with all these cultural training seminars, I never got any of this. But an unexpected journey with a hospital interpreter gave me some of the most helpful insights to my patients. There are obviously so many potential stumbling blocks between doctors and patients, and any caregiver and patient, in the realm of culture. And some of these are obvious. There are cultures that avoid touch between the sexes, religious Muslims, religious Jews. In some cultures, patients are not routinely told information. A classic example at Bellevue is the elderly Chinese grandfather, and the grown son says, don't tell him his diagnosis, just tell it to me, which obviously creates some ethical dilemmas in Western society. In some cultures, avoiding eye contact is a sign of respect. Cambodian culture, some Middle Eastern cultures, whereas in the West, avoiding eye contact is considered disrespectful, except in New York, where no one looks at each other. And then there are cultural gaps within our own culture. Teenagers, for example, are their own culture, and many of us have no idea how to communicate with them. In fact, I live in fear of adolescence, which is coming up soon for our family. A couple months ago, I had a young man who came to my clinic complaining of urethral discharge and discomfort, and I had him undressed, and I went to examine him, trying to put him at ease and be as respectful as possible. But then I was faced with a disturbingly large number of penile piercings, bars, hoops, studs, things that I did not think were anatomically possible. And I realized that I was facing an entirely new culture, one that was as alien to me as the burqa-wearing women in Afghanistan. I didn't know the first words of the language of this culture. I did not know what to say, other than, I think I might have an explanation for your symptoms. And I could have started on a journey with him. In fact, I was filled with questions, particularly logistical ones. But I have to confess that my discomfort prevented me from taking that particular journey. But maybe next time. I'm sure there's a lot I could learn, and probably a lot I need to learn. So we usually think about stereotyping in terms of people who are different from ourselves. But is it possible to stereotype against yourself? One Thursday morning, I had a healthy, middle-aged, educated white woman. And she unfolded a sheet of paper with a brisk snap, and I could see 30 lines of handwritten questions, and my heart sank. I was seeing just the patient I hated, me, right? The classic worried-well neurotic, the Woody Allen with XX chromosomes. And she complained of headaches, eye pain, abdominal pain, dry skin, dizziness, pounding in her ear, shortness of breath, discolored toenails, aching shoulders, cramps in her neck, tightness in her gut. And she's a patient like Nasmuddin, with whom I studiously avoid the review of systems. So instead I asked about stress. And it turned out she was caring for her ill elderly mother, trying to juggle her mother's many medical appointments while dealing with her own stressful job and unsympathetic boss. She had a normal physical exam and a normal stress test recently. Everything clicked together. I told her that I did not think she had any serious illness, but these were all likely symptoms of stress, and she was quite relieved to hear that. That was Thursday. Everything seems to happen on a Thursday. Saturday night, I was paged to the emergency room. She'd been admitted to the hospital for a blood clot in the lung, bilateral. My mind raked back over our clinic visit, all the symptoms she had listed, and there it was, shortness of breath, buried in between the pounding in her ears and the discolored toenails. I'd somehow missed it, or just not given it much weight, because it was drowning in the sea of her other complaints, but it was there. I had just stereotyped myself, white, educated, female, neurotic, and not taken her symptoms seriously, missing a potentially fatal disease. Perhaps I should journey a little bit more with my own ilk. But I want to tell you a little bit more about my journey with Nasmuddin. This continued over many years, and she's still my patient today. And this part happened rather recently. Nasmuddin was on the schedule for an appointment, but Azina, now a freshman at a community college in Queens, showed up instead. Mrs. Udine wasn't feeling well and had sent her daughter to pick up her prescriptions. The elevators, as usual, were packed, and so Azina had sprinted up the 3 flights of stairs in order to be on time. She was breathless when she arrived, skin flushed, cheeks puffing from exertion, upper lip peaked with moisture. Her hair was coming undone from its ponytail. It was only when she used the back of her hand to wipe off the sweat that it occurred to me what was different. There was no veil. There was no headscarf. Her round, cherubic face was completely exposed. The thick strands of her dark hair were glistening even under the harsh fluorescent lights. She wore jeans and a sweater. There was no gown covering her clothes. "I'm sorry my mom couldn't make it," she said, taking quick breaths between the words. "She promises not to miss the next appointment." She pulled a clutch of refill slips out of her bag. "These are the prescriptions that she needs." "Azina," I said, my mouth hanging open, "what happened to—" And then I stopped, unsure if I might be treading in territory that was too personal. Had Azina embarked on a college rebellion? Was there a falling out with her family? Did she find a boyfriend who was less religious or not Muslim at all? Was she making a statement about assimilation? But then I recalled how forthrightly and warmly Azina had spoken about her veil the other time. And so I decided to ask, "Azina, what happened to your veil?" Azina laid the papers on my desk and smoothed them carefully. Her breathlessness was receding, and she spoke more slowly now. I had an incident 3 days ago." "An incident?" I said. What do you mean?" "I was waiting for the bus on my way to school, and there was this guy at the bus stop." Azina looked past me as she spoke, directing her words toward the wall. "He was looking at me funny. Then he started to talk to me. 9/11 was your fault," he said. "You killed 3,000 Americans. So I said to him, "I'm Bangladeshi. Bangladesh had nothing to do with 9/11. Then he started to walk toward me in this threatening way, saying over and over, "It was your fault. 9/11 was your fault." I backed up against the wall of the bus shelter, and then he pulled out a knife and waved it in my face. "You people ruined our country," he yelled. I couldn't move. He had me pinned against the wall. Then he reached over with the knife and tore off my veil and headscarf with it. I was so scared he was going to stab me. The only thing I remember was that the pins that held the veil on the back scratched my neck as it came off. I must have screamed, I don't even remember, and some teenagers passing by jumped on him and pulled him off me. Azina's voice sounded wooden as she spoke, but to me, it was a sledgehammer in the chest. Someone called the cops, she continued, and they came pretty quickly, but I felt so naked, so exposed, in front of all these strangers, so embarrassed that I was the cause of all this. The police brought me home. They tried to make me feel safe, but I wouldn't leave the house for 2 whole days. Today's the first day I've gone out. My father told me to stop wearing the veil, that it was too dangerous. I looked up at Azina, her somber demeanor, a punishing contrast to the voluble, engaging teenager who had spoken to me last time. I reached over and touched her sleeve. "Azina, I'm so sorry this happened. It's okay," she said, cutting me off. "It's not anyone's fault. There are stupid people everywhere, and he was just a stupid person." But still, I said, "This is horrible." "I'm getting over it," she said, the color returning to her voice. "I've decided that I'll probably wear my headscarf, but maybe not the veil. My father is against it, but this is America, and I can do what I want. Besides, I can't just sit around feeling sorry for myself. I need my energy to finish pharmacy school and to take care of my mother." She rolled her eyes dramatically, and you know how much TLC my mother needs. I was impressed by Azina's resilience, but felt horrible that America, my America, was forcing her to remove her veil and maybe even her headscarf too. I was furious at that racist punk who had threatened her very way of life, who had latched on to one of the key things that made Azina who she was, her veil and her headscarf. Literally wrenched it away from her. I would have strangled him if I could have gotten my hands on him. Suddenly I realized that I, left-wing, liberal, atheist, Jewish feminist, had become a defender of the religious Muslim veil. I still have sentiments about the veil and what it represents, but I was crushed that Azina felt she could no longer wear hers. This journey had taken me to some very unexpected places. The cultural challenges in medicine will continue to multiply in amount and complexity. The medical workforce is diversifying, but not nearly as fast as our patient base. For most of us, the multicultural awareness education we receive does little to impact our day-to-day experiences. This is not to deny that it's helpful to know some facts about different cultures. For example, it helps to know that the number 4 is considered unlucky by many Asian cultures, because the word for 4 is similar to the word for death. And there are many patients I've seen who don't want to be in a room that has the number 4 in it. And in fact, I just read about a hospital in California that it no longer has a 4th floor, the way some places don't have a 13th floor. It's helpful to know that many religious Sikhs who don't shave their head also won't shave their groin for a cardiac cath. It's helpful to know that many Mormons won't remove their religious undergarments even for surgery. Some traditional Southeast Asian cultures limit the cuddling and fussing over newborns. They're worried that it will attract the attention of evil spirits. But this can be interpreted by Westerners as poor bonding and often attracts the attention of child protective services. So all these are examples of traditions that are common and certainly helpful to know them. But they by no means define the individual patient. They only offer a backdrop. Those of us involved in direct patient care know that it's always a one-on-one affair, both for the illness at hand and the culture from which the patient arises. I often think about one of my patients. He's from Puerto Rico, raised by a Basque mother and an Italian-speaking half Native American, half African American father, who converted to Judaism when he got married. And he looks like a Puerto Rican Tevye from Fiddler on the Roof. And whenever I see him, I say, "How are you, Mr. Manus?" He's like, "Baruch Hashem, I'm still here." And then whenever I want to talk about his diabetes, he's got 27 opinions about how we should treat it. Well, how would I categorize him? So it becomes an individual journey for every caregiver with each of their patients. And the goal of my talk is to encourage us to take that journey, to not be afraid to ask and learn about our patients' lives. The journey itself is always richer and more alive than whatever destination is our goal. I always close my lectures with a quote from John Stone, who, as many of you know, was a poet and cardiologist from Emory, who sadly passed away the year before last. He edited the anthology on doctrine, which many medical students got for free when they started medical school. And I read his poem, Gaudiamus Igitur, at the end of each month I attend on the awards. Gaudiamus Igitur was a poem he wrote as a commencement speech for a class at Emory who probably did not realize how lucky they were. It's a long 4-page poem, and I tend to get a double chocolate cake to, placate my students as I read it. And there's so many words of wisdom, but I'll just pick one line. He writes, "For you will learn to see most acutely out of the corner of your eye, to hear best with your inner ear." And I'll just say that one more time. "For you will learn to see most acutely out of the corner of your eye, to hear best with your inner ear." And these are the ways that poets view the world. And we as caregivers can open ourselves up to these journeys with our patients, learn from these journeys, enjoy these journeys, and ultimately practice better medicine if we learn from the poets. So buckle your seatbelt, cock your inner ear, open the corner of your eye, and enjoy the ride. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We'll now look to the audience for any questions. Slide it all the way. Yeah, okay, there we go, sorry. Thank you, Danielle. Anyone have questions that you'd like to ask Danielle?
Danielle, that was wonderful, and it's an interesting talk to hear on the eve of our outpatient clinics going to an electronic medical record. And I just wanted to ask you, you alluded to an electronic medical record at NYU, and I just wanted to know, what do you do with the poetry of the patient when the electronic medical record may give you little boxes to...
It's a good question. I actually talk a lot about the EMR because I'm intrigued by how it's changed things in our lives. But one of the things is that our past medical history field is still free text, and I use that past medical history quite liberally. And whenever a house sec presents a patient, and I'm going to get to social, and they say no tobacco, drugs, and allergy, and alcohol, I would say, well, it should start with born in X, came to U.S. when, married, where do they live, who are they? And so I actually write all that stuff down in my free text past medical, so it's always there. In fact, so sometimes I'll get a resident who's been a little more active will say, well, they're a Hispanic patient. I'm like, well, they speak Spanish in a lot of countries. What country? Then I'll get, it's a Mexican patient. You're like, do you know how big Mexico is? Where in Mexico are they from? And they look at me with Deli, and I always say, I'll bet you 20 bucks they're from Puebla. Go back and ask. And I always win the bet because I know by now that almost every Mexican in New York comes from the state of Puebla because of the family networks. And in Seattle, they're all from Michoacan. So you start to learn these things over time, but I find EMR actually helps me in the sense that I write all this down. I also keep track of what's the big issue of their life. Is it their ill mother, the child, is having trouble, so I can ask about it next time. And that field is fixed, so I take advantage of the EMR for that part.
Dr. Becker, maybe you'll meet me coming down the steps. Thank you.
Thank you, Danielle. I'm a primary care doctor. I wanted to thank you for your recent rant in the New England Journal against sort of report cards, and if poetry is what's lost in translation, then I think the medical report card is losing all the poetry of the medical encounter, and I think what you said was, someone needed to say it. I'm glad you did. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We actually had a conversation this morning about physician report cards, and as you know, we measure things that are easy to measure that fit into Excel spreadsheets, and so much doesn't fit on a spreadsheet, and people often ask, and I respect numbers. I have a PhD after all, so I really believe strongly in numbers, but I always want to say, well, when your child is ill or your mother's ill, how do you pick a doctor? Do you go online and see what their A1C numbers are, or do you ask someone who's a really good doctor that you trust? And I think ultimately that's how most of us want to pick our doctors, not by who gets their blood pressure below 130/70. So I think, I don't have the answer how we measure that part, but I always say it's a bit like pornography. You know it when you see it, when you have a good doctor who's got good judgment and skill, and you know when you don't see it. I don't yet have the answer of how we measure that, but I agree those report cards don't capture so much of what the essence of caregiving is.
Anyone else? Thank you.
Okay, I just wonder how you manage everything. You have 3 children, you're a full-time physician, then you're writing in various venues. I just wonder how you manage all of that.
That's the famous question. Well, one thing is that I don't manage all these things. So in short order, on the priority list is online grocery delivery, daycare, and not commuting. I would say are the biggest time savers in my life. I don't ever go into a store. I don't ever drive, take a bus or a subway to get to work. And as soon as the pregnancy test is positive, you tell the daycare director, not your spouse or your parents, and get on that list. and then I've actually divided my day in that I'm part-time in the clinic. And that was a hack sense we were talking about this morning. When I applied for my first job, there was a financial crisis then as now, and there was a hiring freeze. When the freeze unfroze, the only position available was part-time, 3 days a week, which I never in a million years thought about, but I had student loans to pay off and I took the 3-day-a-week job. And I had these 2 days, and I used those days, and that's actually when I started writing. And to this day, I preserved those 2 days. And when the full-time offer came up, which would double my salary overnight, I realized, what would I buy with this money? I don't need a car. I can't afford an apartment in New York in any case. I'd want to buy time. The one thing I really couldn't buy, and I feel as though I bought the time by turning down the full-time offer. And so I guard those days pretty zealously to do everything in life, writing, editing, music that I can't do. But then I also, cross off many things that will never happen in my life. Original home-cooked meals, kids dressed with matching socks, me dressed with matching socks, all those things. And I envy people who, come off the plane looking so put together. That won't be us, but we'll try to read a lot. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm Sebastian. Can you tell us a little bit about your writing process, just in any detail you want, whether it's the morning or the evening, or any kind of detail?
Writing process, well, it's a big question. I mean, for me, it has to be a quiet time. I can't write between patients, as some doctors do. I can't do what Jerome Gutman does, which is get up at 4 in the morning and write for an hour or two. So I only do it on my days away from work, when I'm home, just me and the dog. Sometimes I find that I need to let time pass between when the event has happened and when I can write about it. And I don't know if that's being lazy, if that's a protective mechanism, or is it too emotional at that moment to write about it? Is it a time for processing? But I find that I really do need to let time pass. And for my first book, it was some cases 10 years when that time passed. And then I much prefer revising over writing. I'm really intimidated by a blank screen trying to write, but I love revising, and I can revise till the cows come home, which is why I think I like editing, because editing is all about revising, and someone else has to do the work of the white pig. But I think that revising allows you to revisit. And even writing itself is so much slower. When the event occurs, it's happening so fast, and the minute that patient encounter ends, you've got 10 more admissions, so you don't have time to contemplate what just happened. But writing is so slow, and the prologue to Singular Intimacies, called Possessing Her Words, actually was an event that happened when I was attending in an ICU, and I got home that night and I emailed a friend, you would not believe what happened today, kind of email. And then later that epistle became the basis of the story that later on I was able to revise and revisit and I guess sort out how I felt about it. And I think the conclusions that I drew after revising were much different than what I felt at the immediate end of the day. So I find that it in and of itself really helps to spread over time and do it slowly and carefully. And then, I sometimes get feedback from other writing friends or family members. But largely I do it in a quiet room with just a dog, which I highly recommend for writing. Although the only downside is they nuzzle your hand while you write, so a lot of typos get introduced, and some dog drool on the keyboard.
I think we've come to the end of our time, so I want to invite you to thank Danielle again with me. It's a wonderful conversation. Next week we'll turn to the history of medicine and a lecture sponsored by the Medical Center Hour in the History of the Health Sciences lecture series. It's called CSI Edinburgh, Forensic Science in the Era of Burke and Hare's Anatomy Murders. So you need to be here and all your friends. Thanks again, Danielle.